Welcome to this author interaction of the NLF Reading Challenge 2023. My name is Deepti, and I hope you are as excited as I am to be here. Before we begin the interaction, let me give you a brief introduction about the NLF Reading Challenge, followed by a few housekeeping rules for today's session. The NLF Reading Challenge is a 3-month-long reading event from July to October 2023 for students between grades 4 to 6. It runs on the competitive as well as the non-competitive tracks. For the challenge, students read their way through a curated set of 30 books. They discuss their reading with their friends and their guide, log their thoughts, and get to interact with the authors of some of these books. The challenge will conclude with a quiz competition that will see the 3 best teams win gold, silver, and bronze engraved trophies, certificates of achievement, and a wonderful set of books. For today's event, please use the Q&A box to type out your questions or your responses to what's being discussed during the session. If you're a student, a teacher, or a school librarian, please mention the name of your school along with your question as well. In fact, if you already have your questions ready, please feel free to type them out. Today, we are honored to have with us the incredibly talented author, Frances Hardinge. Frances is a celebrated author with 10 books to her name. Her debut novel, Fly By Night, won the Branford Boase Award in 2006. All of her books have been critically acclaimed and have found their place on many prestigious shortlists, including the Carnegie Medal, the Guardian Children's Fiction Prize, and many more. Her book, The Light Tree, won not only the Costa Children's Book Prize, but also the overall Costa Book of the Year award. It also won the 2016 Boston Globe Horn Book Fiction Award, as well as the UK LA Book Awards and the LA Times Book Award for Young Adult Literature. We had the pleasure of hearing Frances speak about her book, Deep Light, during our 2021 edition of the Reading Challenge. Today, we are honored to welcome her back to discuss her newest work, Unraveller. This dark and mystical tale takes readers on a fast-paced journey into a magical world filled with curses and creatures of the wild. Welcome, Frances. We're very happy to have you with us today.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me back. It's lovely to see you again.
It's our absolute pleasure. Would you like to begin the session by reading a little bit from the book?
Certainly. Now, I'm going to be reading a section from the prologue. And first, I'm just going to explain a little. My book, Unraveller, is set in an imaginary country called Radith, which is mostly a common sense sort of seeming place, apart from a narrow strip of misty marsh woods down the coast called the Wilds. And that is a place of dark dreams and strange creatures. Now, I'm going to read a section from the prologue, which is written as though talking to an imaginary visitor to Radith. From the raised road, you will at last have a view down to the famous wilds that line the Radith coast. Prepare to be very, very disappointed. Admit it. The wilds were one of the reasons you came to Radith in the first place. You had read stories of these sprawling, misty marsh woods, veiled with cobweb and dripping with emerald moss. You had heard of the shape-shifting brags, the dagger-toothed marsh horses, the dancing glimmers that lure you into danger, and the pale-handed ladies who offer secrets if you can solve their riddles. Yet here you are, staring down at a meagre band of damp greyish woodland, only a few miles deep. Is that what all the fuss is about? So narrow and dull-looking. How could it possibly hide ancient ruins, secret castles, or mysterious lakes? How could anyone wander lost in the wilds for years? If you are rash enough to venture down among the trees, you will discover your error quickly. the innocent appearance of the wilds is a lie. The marsh woods are every bit as strange, vast and perilous as the stories say. However, it is much more likely that you will lose interest in visiting the wilds now that you have seen them. You only think that you have seen them. You will believe the evidence of your own eyes and mind, which tell you there is nothing worth seeing here. They are lying.
Thank you, Francis, for that lovely reading. I think I got goosebumps just from hearing you read. And there's something so magical about your writing, and it's such a pleasure to hear you read out that little bit of prologue.
Thank you.
So let's jump right into the questions that we've prepared for you while we wait for the audience questions to come in. Our first question for you, Francis, is about the difficult themes that you weave into your work. In your latest book, in Unraveller, you've explored the complexities of anger, hate, and revenge through the cursors, as well as those who have been cursed. And the concept of curse eggs brilliantly allows the readers to see the tangible effects of hate and thoughts of revenge, which closely mirror real life struggles. And you also mentioned that Unraveller is about trauma and recovery. And I remember from your discussion about Deep Light that you wanted to explore themes of power and religion. Now, these are difficult topics, but you've chosen to address them in children's and young adult books. What draws you to explore such profound themes through your work? And what do you hope your young readers take away from your books?
Well, first of all, I'm a storyteller. I don't decide on a theme and then try to find a way to construct a story around it. I always start with the story concept first, and it's got to be something that calls to me, that I find interesting or exciting or has emotional punch for me. But then the themes creep in, things that I care about or feel deeply about or concerned about. And sometimes these are subjects that I myself am still working to explore and understand and work through. So these are quite often difficult and thorny and quite dark subjects. So the question is, should I hold back from that just because I'm writing for younger readers? And I think the answer is no, because I think younger readers can actually cope with these pretty heavyweight themes just fine. And they live in the world too. They've got eyes. Younger readers are often a lot more aware of the darker things going on in the world than a lot of adults seem to think.
Thank you for that answer. And I think we need to give children more credit than they actually get, right? So my next question is about the plot. You've spoken a lot about trauma and recovery. So the story is driven by a sense of urgency as Kellen and Nettle race to uncover the identity of Kellen's cursor. But amidst this fast-paced plot, you also take the time to humanize characters. For example, Pale Mallow and her daughter Clover. You shed light on the effects of trauma and the path to recovery. And as we learn through Kellen, unraveling is not just a matter of using magic to remove the curse. It requires finding the underlying reasons and carefully untangling the threads that wove it in the first place. I couldn't help but notice the parallels you drew to therapy and self-reflection. Were these nuances of recovery and the emphasis on understanding one's flaws intentional aspects you wanted to explore from the beginning? Or was it something that naturally emerged as the story unfolded?
It was always part of the story. As you can tell, the plot of Unraveller is partly based on folklore and fairy tale. And in those stories, you get a lot of enchantments, curses, people who are transformed or inspelled in some way. And reading those, I was always fascinated by the idea of the aftermaths we don't see. The things that are swept under the doormat of the happy ending. And I mean, for example, I mean, imagine you've spent several years as a footstool or a wasp or a bird, and then got changed back. You might have a few quirks after that. You know, you probably wouldn't find it that easy just to go straight back to ordinary life. I mean, imagine you've been asleep for 100 years. Well, congratulations, you're better, but everyone you know is dead. Imagine that you'd been transformed into a creature or a monster that's done terrible things while you were not yourself. How do you deal with that? So this element of the aftermath was what interested me, whereas in most fairy stories, the point where the curse is lifted is the happy ending. That's the point where traditionally the story ends. In my mind, that's where the story was beginning. So I think I always knew that I would be exploring the way people actually recover from difficult times in their lives. And it's not by saying the right words to lift a curse or waving a magic wand. It's much harder than that, and it takes a lot longer. But importantly, it is possible.
Thank you for that beautiful answer. So we have an audience question that's come in. Abha Sardesai asks, in your book Unraveller, you've written about the importance of curses. What gave you the idea of writing about curses? And how did you come up with the idea of Nettle and her siblings being cursed into birds? And there's another question by Avigna Satish, who asks, how does Nettle become a curser? Who does she hate?
Right. So that's 3 different questions. So the first one, how did I come up with curses generally? Mostly, I came up with the idea of curses because of having read a lot of fairy tales, a lot of folk tales, where you have, and legends, where you have curses being cast by one person or another. I think that idea particularly drew to me because we're living in a time of anger and hate, unfortunately, as I'm sure a lot of you have noticed, where people are divided, where people are demonizing each other, and seeing quite skewed ideas of each other. So it felt, because of that, it had quite a lot of emotional resonance for me. This feels like a world we're all living in. In terms of the next question about Nettle and her siblings, the idea of them all being cursed into being birds, that's specifically inspired by a literary fairy tale called Wild Swans, written by Hans Christian Andersen, which is itself inspired by other older legends like the Children of Lear. And in Wild Swans, a wicked stepmother curses her 11 stepsons to become swans, and the only person she can't curse is her stepdaughter, who then has to try and find ways of curing her brother's curse. And the only way she can do that is by knitting shirts for them out of nettles. And yes, that is why I gave Nettle her name. And she does eventually manage it, but by the time she has successfully knitted all the shirts, she's about to be burned as a witch, and she's also not allowed to speak or anything while she's doing this knitting. So she can't explain herself. And she's on the way to be burned at the stake when the swans fly down and she's able to throw the mostly finished shirts over her brothers and change them back, all except for one where she hasn't quite finished the shirt and he's got a swan wing still at the end. But then the curse is lifted, they change back, she can explain, happy ending. But I was always left thinking, what about that guy with the swan wing? Is he okay? Is he stuck like that now? In fact, are any of them okay? They've spent a lot of time with swans. How easy is it going to be to go back to being people again now? Will they miss being able to fly? So yes, that's the inspiration for Nettle's family's background. And what was the third one again?
Why did Nettle become a curser?
She has a lot of built up pain and anguish and anger. And she could have directed it to the person who actually cursed her, who was her stepmother, except that by the time she gets changed back, her stepmother's dead. So all that anger, all that difficult to deal with emotion has nowhere to go. And So it's just built up inside her. She's got no outlet for it, and becomes generally directed towards a world that she can't quite cope with. And she feels very guilty about it. I think you can see that she feels really conflicted, but she doesn't feel she can talk about it. She doesn't feel that she can vent it anywhere. And so it just builds up inside her.
And that's also why she ends up sticking with Kellen, right? Because she's so frustrated that he doesn't think about the aftermath as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, they're very different characters.
Yeah, and the perfect complement to each other as well. So we have a question from Kaira Mohanraj, and that touches a little bit upon what you just said. How did you think of, or rather create, the land of Radith? The wilds, the people, the place itself? What inspired Radith? What made it all come together? And I wanted to add a little bit to that question. You've previously described the act of research as treasure hunting, which I find fascinating. And I can only imagine the exhaustive research that must have gone into crafting this book. And world building also seems like something that you truly enjoy. Like you said, Unraveller draws its inspiration from fairy tales, myths, and legends. And you've also created memorable characters of your own, such as the little brothers, the book bearers, to name a few. How do you do this? Like, do you sketch out a narrative arc prior to your research? Or if not, how do you extract and weave a story set in such an incredibly detailed world?
Right, there's several questions there. So I will answer your question first, then I'll talk in more detail about the inspirations behind Radith. So the short answer is that I sort of research and create my narrative arc in parallel during the planning stage before I actually plunge in with the writing. There's an awful lot of research and brainstorming that happens side by side. Now, I did from the start know some of the folk tales and mythical creatures that I did want to be drawing on, and I knew the main psychological arcs for the characters, the two main characters. So I had a sort of outline story in my head, but then I did a lot more research and came up with more details for the history of Radith, places in Radith, creatures in the wilds, and every time I got new ideas that added more twists and turns to the story. So in terms of Radith, some of the ideas that I drew on in terms of places, well, the wilds itself is partly inspired by a place called Garahone in La Gomera. La Gomera is one of the Canary Islands, and Garahone is actually a set of cloud forests in the middle of the island, very beautiful and quite strange. You get these twisted trees that are absolutely dripping with brilliant green moss. And sometimes you have them gleaming in the sunlight, and other times you get sinuous mist creeping between the trees. So it seems like an otherworldly place. It's not a marsh woods because it's actually quite high up, but I basically took those woods and made them a lot more marshy to turn them into my wilds. There are other things that I knew I was going to be drawing on as well, like the marsh horses are based on kelpies. The dancing stars are based on lots of legends that crop up all over the place in marshy places of dancing lights that will appear within sight of late night travelers to try to lure them into the dangerous, treacherous bogs. And the midnight markets, the moonlit markets, those are based on other legends of eldritch markets of one sort or another, some of which crop up in fiction. For example, there's Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market. That's a little bit like that. Dangerous markets where you could buy or lose just about anything. So I knew those were things that I wanted to include. Radith itself was mostly a matter of me trying to work out what a country would be like if if it existed with the wilds down the side of it. And I was thinking, instead of everybody just being quiveringly afraid, like Transylvanian villagers in Dracula going, "Oh no, don't go near the wilds," or trying to pretend the wilds didn't exist. What if they accepted the wilds existed, but were actually quite practical about it? Wouldn't that be more interesting? And then I started to look at ways the society might have developed, how the infrastructure would exist, how money would work, because if there's a danger of your money turning into leaves, well, you have to take precautions about that, don't you? And so most of the way Radith came together wasn't so much research, it was brainstorming and thinking things through logically from my fundamental, very strange premise.
That sounds like a lot of information to keep in place. But yeah, thank you for that very detailed answer. We have an audience question that's come in. Induja Shanmukaraj asks, why did you choose spider-related creatures for the creature that makes people cursors?
You're not the first person to ask that. I chose spiders, spider-like features, as the curse makers, partly because I already knew that I wanted Kellen to unravel the curses, which implies that there have to be threads. So I quite like the idea of the curse givers basically being weavers. I also thought that spiders would be fun things to have running around in the wilds, filling some of the trees with cobwebs so they almost look greyish. And also, spiders, it's not their fault, but they're a little bit sinister looking. They're a good way of slightly creeping people out. I'm also a arachnophobe myself, so I'm not completely comfortable around spiders, but they seemed appropriate.
Definitely appropriate. It really upped the eeriness of the book, I think. But talking about the little brothers, the whole concept of little brothers that you created, this creature where these creatures have taken it upon themselves to empower those who have been oppressed. But they also overlook the flaws in human nature, our tendencies towards jealousy, grudges, selfishness, and as well as the fact that not everyone who feels wronged may be justified in their beliefs. You wrote this book during the pandemic, and it was a difficult time, and there is a lot of darkness in the world, like you said. But at that time in particular, there was a lot of distressing news all around us, and we saw firsthand how the people with the least amount of social privilege and economic privilege were the ones who were the most badly affected. Did the state of the world at that time influence your thought process and exploration of this theme in any way? We also have a slightly related question from Aryaman Kindra, who asks, why have you added the emotions sadness and nervousness, but not happiness to balance the book?
So the first question first about the pandemic. I'm sure it did influence the way I wrote the book. It is very true that during the pandemic, existing inequalities were very much thrown into sharp relief. We were clearly not all having the same pandemic. We were not all having the same lockdown. Not everybody had a nice garden to sit in during lockdown or green places to walk. Not everyone had savings to fall back on when their jobs were in trouble. Not everyone had the same luxuries of safety. And unfortunately, there were also some powerful people who actually created the lockdown rules who then broke them with apparent impunity, which made a lot of people really upset. So yes, it did highlight a lot of unfairness. In a funny kind of way, it was also a strange time to be writing Unraveller, because particularly during the first lockdown, it sort of felt as if the world had been transformed. It felt as if the world was under a spell. Occasionally I was walking down completely silent streets in which the wildlife was actually looking a bit bolder, and no planes in the sky, and people hiding indoors or scurrying away from each other. It was a bit as if the world was in a sort of enchanted sleep. And then even when lockdown started lifting, it still felt strange. It felt like the curse had lifted and yet nothing was over. Everything was back to normal and yet it wasn't. So again, I think that fed into the way I was writing some of the curse victims who'd had their curses lifted. In terms of the emotional balance in the book, I'm hoping there's some happiness in it, or at least hope. I am dealing with some sad and painful subject matter, and with things like anger and hate, but I am taking the reader into a dark forest and hopefully showing them that there are paths out of it. And some readers, I think, will probably know those dark forests already, in which case being told that there's paths out of it might be the most important thing I can tell them.
And absolutely agree with you. There is so much hope in the book, especially Gaul's story, especially the ending of that, which had me crying happy tears. So definitely there is happiness, or maybe not explicit happiness, but definitely, like you said, there is hope. So we have about 3 minutes left, and we have one last question from the audience. Parsha Session asks, have you ever had an idea that made you think that's too far-fetched to work before you went ahead and made it work?
I have had a number of ideas that I've had a number of ideas that I wasn't sure I could make work, and have sort of managed so far. But then again, sometimes the opposite has happened. Sometimes I have an aspect of my mind that looks at ideas and thinks, is that interesting enough? Is that odd enough? Is it different enough? That sounds a little bit like something I've read already, and so I'll change it to make it weirder and weirder and weirder. I wrote one book, my 5th book, which is set in an underground city where people have to be taught expressions, where there's exploding cheeses and glowing Venus flytraps and mind control potions, and somebody who performs acts of divination by stealing things. And I remember running all this past a friend of mine and saying, do you think it's a bit boring? Is this a bit samey? And she said, no, Frances, this is whacked out. So sometimes I lose track of quite how odd my ideas have become.
We are very grateful for your very odd ideas because they come out in such beautiful work.
Thank you.
Can I end with one last question? You created these really beautiful, intricate worlds, but only one of your book has a sequel to it. Are you ever tempted to go back and revisit these worlds and create more stories in them?
I am tempted to go back to the world for which I did write a sequel. I'm tempted to go back to the world of Fly By Night and Twilight Robbery, because I can think of more adventures that I could write in that world. Things are not resolved there, and there's more that I think my heroine and her terrifying goose could actually do. So at some point I'd quite like to do that. As for the others, I sort of feel as though I have told the story I wanted to tell in those settings. I can't rule out the possibility that I might come up with another story that I'd really want to tell in those worlds, but it would have to be that way round. I'd have to think of a story I want to tell. It wouldn't be a matter of going back to a world I've used and then trying to wring it out like a sponge to make another story. We will see.
Thank you, Frances. That's been an incredible half hour, and I can't believe it's over already. But thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. And thank you for all your questions, everyone. Bye.